This is the Tactile Knife Co. Chupacabra, and it is the newest release from Tactile Knife Co. This is Clark the Knife, and my goal is to give you the most complete, clear, and helpful guide to knives on the web, and to help you make a more informed purchase. Let's get to it. I'm going to go through the knife tip to tail, what I like, what I don't like, what I feel neutral about, and my goal is to give you a complete understanding of whether you want to buy these things, one of these things or not, based on your own sort of priorities. So, I've got the specs on the table here. This is a Tactile Knife Co. Chupacabra. It is made in the USA. It goes for $250 if you buy it straight from Tactile Knife Company. It's going to go for probably about $220 or so on the secondary market. Again, made in Texas. I believe they make all of their parts in the USA as well. If not, they certainly make most of them in the USA. Blade here, 3.3 inches, 7.73 inches for the whole knife. Comes into at 4.72 ounces, which we will talk about much more later. And the blade stock here is 135 thousandths, which for a knife of this size is not thin. It's not thick, but it's also not thin. If we pull out some size comparisons, you can see it's a little bit shorter than your PM2. It's also a little bit thinner in your blade stock, though not really thinner in the overall carry profile than your PM2. If we compare this to a Hinderer, this is a skinny XM18, but there it is compared to your skinny XM18. You can see a lot of not dissimilar lines in the handle to the XM18, but overall just a little bit smaller. Let's compare this to maybe you had a Maverick from Tactile Knife Co. And you can see this is pretty similar in length to the Maverick, though it carries as a much smaller knife just because of it carries as a much larger knife. The Maverick carries as a much smaller knife because it is less tall, it is narrower, it is thinner, and it is a lot lighter. And then as one last size comparison, let's just pull out a Delica here, and you can see it's quite a bit bigger than the Delica. So, there are your specifications for the Chupacabra. Let's get on to, and these handles, aluminum with steel liners. Let's get on to what's good and what's not so good about this knife. First, an overview. What have we got here? We got a MagnaCut blade. This is a sheep's foot. And I seem to have a lot of people arguing about, what is and isn't a sheep's foot in my comments. If this isn't a sheep's foot, I literally don't know what is a sheep's foot. This is about as stereotypical a sheep's foot as you're going to find. Flat across the top, little dip toward the tip, belly all the way up to the tip with that sort of rounded tip, which is designed to intentionally not provide as much of a piercing tip for safety purposes, and just because it's really designed for your utility cuts, your downward cuts, things like that. This handle here, full flat aluminum with big thick chamfers all the way around with full steel liners under the aluminum. That's where that 4.72 ounce for a 3.3 inch blade comes in. That is pretty heavy. That's 1.5 ounces per inch of blade length. That is because this thing has full steel liners without much milling on those steel liners underneath these aluminum scales. It also makes it, a little bit chunky. This is not a thin knife, despite the blade stock not being thick, but it sort of carries like a bit of a thicker knife than it normally is, or than you might think it is, based on the blade stock. Put it this way, I say more precisely, there are other knives with this blade stock that carry thinner than this one. And then the lock here is the super lock. So you pull this back and it disengages. The only way to deploy this is not a flipper tab. So the only way to deploy it is with that thumb stud there. And then you can either pull that back with your thumb, or you can pull it back with your pointer finger, and that disengages the lock. The super lock is most well known. It's designed by Snex 10. Obviously, if you are made of money, you may have gotten it on one of his Vision Customs, but those run, I think it was $12,000 for one of those. The rest of us mere mortals have experienced it on the Wii Vision R or the Civivi Vision FG, which have effectively the same lock. Mondra? I think it's Mondra. There's one other company that has Sandrin Knives has also made use of, I think the Mondra is one of their models. Sandrin Knives has also made use of the Super Lock. We will talk about that lock more in the pros and cons as well. This is, again, the newest design from Tactile Knife Company, following the Rockwall in 2 forms, the Bear, Bexar in 2 forms, and then the Maverick. And then you've got this. I'm not counting their fixed blades because I don't know if anybody really cares about their fixed blades. But anyway, let's start talking about what I do. We're going to do plus, neutral, and negative. Things that I like, things that I am neutral about, and things that I don't like about this knife. The first positive, and this is a strong positive on this knife, is the blade plus grind. Sheep's foot blades are great users, especially a sheep's foot like this with a relatively high tip, which for a sheep's foot this is. This is an upswept sheep's foot. Rather than keeping the whole thing, facing down and sort of canting this down, they've swept the tip up, so the tip is actually even a little bit above the pivot. That makes it really useful. It gives you a lot of nice big belly. There are a lot of chef knives that have this sort of shape to them, and it's just very versatile. You can use it for chef-style cuts down on the table, though your knuckles are going to run into the table for this. But more importantly, this gives you lots of belly for those long cuts through material, still a relatively high tip to get around and into stuff around your zip ties, around your plants, get your tip into, cardboard as you're dragging it through. And because you've got a long continuous belly, this stays in cuts very nicely, passes through material very nicely. But most importantly, because 135 thousandths isn't thick, but it isn't thin either, this is a pretty aggressive flat grind that gets down to a nice, you can see at the base of the blade there, it does get down to a nice thin cutting edge with a very good factory edge. Tactile used to put terrible factory edges on their knives. They even commented on one of my videos. They have admitted that they used to put terrible factory edges on their knives. That is no longer the case. This thing had a great factory edge, and this thing cut really, really well out of the box. This was a very useful everyday carry blade shape. It's just, for your stuff like cardboard and things like that, it's just very easy to get this down into stuff, do your drag cuts, pull cuts, whatever you want to do. It's very easy to just flip this out, get it into the material, get it under something. If you picture you've got like a zip tie here and you want to get that tip in there, it's easy to get that tip in and pop that zip tie through. It's just a very useful all-around blade shape. It's very similar if you've used the Insingo from Chris Reeve. This feels very similar to the Insingo. For a lot of people, that is their favorite Chris Reeve blade shape, and that is for good reason. It's a really, really good all-around blade shape. So with an aggressive grind, I would say a smart blade stock, because this is a MagnaCut blade. MagnaCut is a very tough steel, and this whole thing, at 4.72 ounces, this is meant to be a user. And the way they've marketed and framed this, they want this to be a hard user. Like basically, not a hard user, but they want this to be a beater sort of knife. It's also, frankly, at $250 priced as a beater sort of knife with made in the USA machining and all that. Thick enough stock that with MagnaCut, which is a relatively tough steel, you can beat on this pretty hard. The fact is, I would say this is a 4V PM2. I would work both of these about as hard as each other in terms of, the blade. These blades can probably take about as much because the PM2 blade stock is only a little bit thicker than the Chupacabra, and the toughness of 4V and MagnaCut are almost identical. So any task that you would be willing to put your PM2 into, especially a tool steel PM2 into, you should feel comfortable putting a tactile Chupacabra into. From the blade perspective, it'll be tough enough to handle that. The other thing that I really like is the ergos are very good. As I've mentioned in many of my reviews, I am a sucker for knives that have handles with big flats and chamfers. I find it gives a really good ergonomic experience when the knife is designed well. This is not a neutral handle. You've got this front curve here. There's no finger choil. Don't even try. This front curve here, one finger fits into there. There's no way you're fitting two fingers in, but it's big enough that probably no matter how big your mitts are, you'll get one finger in there. The rest all nest into this big swoop here. And then you've got a gentle curve across the back. And then you got either some jimping up here, or you can mount your thumb a little bit on here. But honestly, you're probably mounting your thumb up on this jimping. This grip here, where I grip right there, very secure, nice and hand filling. These chamfers all roll into my palm nicely. Can't feel this clip. This is a very secure grip. In particular, this little nook here, where my front pointer finger and my middle finger sit on either side of it, combine that with the jimping. These three fingers are doing, thumb and two fingers, are doing most of the work. This knife wants to stay in place. This is a knife that felt like a user, and even when I choke up, if I want to put my middle finger right here and grab up on the blade, still, the way that they made this front very hooky, whatever finger you put there feels quite secure. I can pinch onto this knife, and it's even secure in this pinch grip here. If I want to drag down onto something, if I want to cut through, pull through something, I would occasionally use this with zip ties, or I would grab it like this, hook under the zip tie and sort of pull like that, or kind of like either hook it through and push like that. It's just the way they've done this front hook here in particular, and the jimping, which is functional. It's sharp enough to be functional for sure without being too grabby. It feels very nice ergonomically because it has these big flats with the chamfers and a relatively big flat on the top and bottom before that chamfer hits. It does not want to roll in your hand. Even though there's no texture on the aluminum, it's very sort of like a Pro-Tech aluminum where you've got that tiny bit of chalky texture, but it's a matte finish. This feels very good, feels very secure in the hand. I wouldn't call it comfortable in the way that a contoured handle would be, but it is absolutely secure. It feels good in the hand, and especially feels good under use. So that's a great start, and I will tell you, my first impression of the Tactile Chupacabra was really, really positive. I was about ready to, after a day or two of using this, give this a raving review because these first two areas are not just good, but they are so obviously good. The blade grind and the blade shape is so obviously useful, and the ergonomics are so obviously excellent that, it's just, my first experiences were really, really strong with this. I'm going to say in the neutral here, I'm going to put the carry and weight as something that is neutral. Carry. Let's make that neutral there. This is a heavy knife. 4.72 ounces for 3.3 inches of blade, especially in 2024. That is heavy. And you know why it's heavy. It's because they have full steel liners. And I mean, functionally, the Super Lock just requires, a lot of steel there. At least the way it's been implemented right here. This is heavy. It is dense. It's also relatively big. You know, if I compare this to the PM2, which is not a small knife, it is almost as big in the pocket as the PM2, which is sort of notorious for being a bit of a pocket hog. If I compare this, I just reviewed the Spy-Mito. The Spy-Mito is, you know, maybe a little bigger in the pocket. If I compare this to something that is small in the pocket, you can see, especially the height, this is significantly taller in the pocket than even your large Sebenza. And so it ends up feeling like it takes up a bit more space. It also feels heavier because of how dense that handle is. This handle definitely feels heavy. The clip, very good. It's a solid deep carry clip. I have no issues with the clip. Hangs in the pocket well, but it just feels a decent bit heavier than I expected. Now, there are two benefits to that weight. One, I'm sure part of the reason it was done was cost savings. Like, the fact is, they probably could have milled these titanium liners out more, shaved a few tenths of an ounce off, made this a little bit lighter. I don't know. I have to assume they couldn't have done it without the liners, or else they would have. Like, that just doesn't seem like the sort of unforced error that Tactile would make. And part of the reason for that weight is the fact that you've got a decent sized blade of 135 thousandths stock out here. The benefit of that weight is that it helps the ergos, because this ends up feeling very handle heavy. Not very, a little handle heavy. Your balance point is pretty far back. You know, it's right there. So the balance point is actually between these first two fingers. That's part of the reason it feels so secure in the hand. So the weight does help the ergonomic experience, and I appreciate that. It's part of why I can drag this through carpet. I can drag this through drywall, stuff like that, especially on like pull cuts like that. This thing feels very, very secure in the hand. And that's why it's neutral, not a negative, because I understand that they have... I shouldn't say I understand. I can believe that the weight they ended up at was a deliberate decision based on the ergonomic experience they wanted the user to have. But it does mean that I have not carried this one as much as I otherwise would have, because unfortunately, I've got quite a few 3.3 inch knives. Like, again, if I bring out the review immediately prior to this one on my channel, is the Spy-Mito. This knife is same size with thicker blade stock, and it's an ounce lighter, and it feels it. This feels easier to carry than the Chupacabra, and as a result, I just have not carried it as much. Basically, after I went through the initial review period where I was carrying this deliberately for the sake of getting to know it, I haven't chosen this one at the start of the day, and a lot of that does come down to the fact that, you know, if I'm choosing between this and, you know, something like an Endura, I've got plenty of other really good tough knives in the 3.3 inch range. This one is just easier to carry. If I'm choosing which one do I want to hang in my pocket all day, I've got to have a really good reason that I want to use the full capabilities of this one to feel like I want to carry that weight. But that could be relevant to you, that could not be. That's the only thing that I'm neutral about. I will say I'm going to put the fit and finish as neutral. Now, Tactile Knife Co. has had an interesting history with fit and finish. So I won't go through the full history because that's pretty obvious if you want to dig into it, but they've been machining stuff for a very long time. They are highly competent machinists. But they had some screw-ups they had a couple screw-ups with the lock bars in the rock wall. They had the issues with the blade grinds with the Bear. They had the issues with blade play with the Maverick. This one here, the grind looks great. The stonewash looks great. The jimping is cut very nicely. The way that this blade carries, the way they knock down the edges, the way it carries that full thickness most of the way out and then tapers pretty heavily toward the tip, looks great. Thumb studs are finished nicely. Chamfers are nice and even. Hardware is flush. Tolerances are very nice and even. Gaps are nice and even. Small enough for $250. I'm fine with all that. Everything looks very good. The one issue I've had real issues with the pivot backing out on the Chupacabra. My Chupacabra, this pivot continuously backs out. And if I use this for even half a day, this pivot will start to back itself out, and then this will develop, it has no play now, but this will start to develop some very significant to the point that it is visible to the naked eye from a few feet away, blade play. And that's another reason that I haven't carried it as much, because this blade just keeps developing play on me, and it's because the pivot keeps backing out. I have tried taking out the pivot and Loctiting it. This is the first knife I have experienced that blue Loctiting the pivot has not fixed the pivot backing out. It is a lot better than it used to be since I used blue Loctite on it. I am not going to use red Loctite on a knife. That's not an option for me. If I need to use red Loctite, I'm going to sell it before I have to do that on any knife. But it was completely unacceptable before I Loctited it, the amount this pivot backed out. And it is still more than I would like. Now it's, if I use this every couple days, I'll have to retighten the pivot. And it's not much. It's not like the pivot is falling out. But if this pivot loosens even a little bit, you'll get some play almost immediately on this blade. And so the fit and finish for the most part is great. Tactile knows how to machine stuff well, but this is another knife where their initial batch, and I got one of the first couple hundred, their initial batch, at least from my experience, probably has a couple little issues. So that's why the fit and finish is neutral. The one thing there are two things that I don't like about this knife, and it's the sort of problem that Tactile tends to have. Tactile, in my experience, makes knives that are repeatedly 90% good and then have a couple issues that really bother me every single time, and I don't think I'm alone in that. The first one is the thumb stud. I want to like this thumb stud. I really do not like this thumb stud. So if you disengage this thumb stud is a rounded dome. It's not like a TRM Atom or a TRM old school where there's a hook underneath and you can catch your thumb under. First off, it's too close to the frame for you to do that. There isn't even space for you to catch, but even then, it's rounded off. There's nowhere to catch. This thumb stud, if you catch it right, the action is pretty nice, and we'll get to that in a second. But if you don't catch it just right, this is the easiest thumb stud to skirt off of that I have ever encountered. Anytime I want to open this knife, I have to think about pushing my thumb in and really pushing to fire it out. Now, this feels like this might have been made this way in response to people who complain about this thumb stud being too pointy, or people who complain about this thumb stud being too rough, or something like that. This is a very comfortable thumb stud that will not hurt your thumb. But the problem is, there's nothing for your thumb to grab onto here. There's nothing that catches your thumb whatsoever. And so as a thumb stud, I mean, yes, now that I've gotten used to it, I can do it pretty reliably. But, I mean, I've been using knives for years and years and years. There is no thumb stud in the last few years that has required as much of a learning curve as this one. And it is just because this thumb stud is just too rounded off and sits too close to the frame And it's those two problems together. If either one of them was fixed, if it was further from the frame, like this cutout could be made deeper without affecting the ergos, or the blade was a little bit taller or something, then you'd have enough space to really get under it and pop it out. Get under this lip and sort of treat it like the TRM ones, where you can catch it that way. Or if this was more hooky, more grabby at the edge here, then you wouldn't need more space. It'd be just like the old TRM ones. It would catch and it would open up. But because it's both slippery and close to the frame, I do not like this thumb stud whatsoever. And actually, if I'm working in the garden or something like that, and my hands are dirty, my hands are wet, anything like that, this literally becomes a two-handed opener for me. If I've got dirt and grime on my hands, there is nothing that I am going to do. I am going to skate off this thing all day if my hands are dirty, and I literally will pull this out of my pocket and two-hand open it. So that thumb stud is a disappointment. Aesthetically, it's nice. It's machined nicely, but from a design perspective, I do not like it. But the most disappointing part, and it's disappointing because I wanted to like it, I really do not like, hey little buggy, I do not like the super lock on this knife. So, the super lock, first off, because people have talked about it, for obvious reasons, it looks similar to the shark lock in that both locks have a little piece up top that you pull back on to disengage the blade and let it swing basically freely shut. That is basically where the similarities end. Both functionally, functionally from an engineering perspective, they work quite differently, but they also feel very different. The shark lock, one of the things that is great about the shark lock, and I'm not the biggest shark lock fan in the world, but I acknowledge that it's a really impressive lock in a lot of ways, is that it is very, pun intended, tactile, in the sense that you get this huge travel in the lock that lets you know that it's disengaged. When you pull back, you know if you did or didn't pull back enough, especially once you've done it a few times, to disengage that blade. And so it gives you this natural feedback that is very intuitive once you use it. The biggest difference in the shark lock, from an experience perspective, and that's what I'm talking about. Forget the engineering details. That's all a means to an end. Everything about engineering a knife lock is a means to give a certain experience to the user. Is solving an engineering problem, is that when you pull the shark lock back, look at how much travel that has. And I'm pulling as hard as I can. Now, when I pull it back there, it does disengage. But if I pull it back here, still not disengaged. I've got to pull it all the way back to here to disengage. But even then, that's very little travel. It's also a very hard spring. I am pulling hard. There's a reason that this is jimped on both sides of the lock here. I need all that jimping. And if this was not jimped, I have to pull hard enough, I would be slipping off of this every single time. And so honestly, with the shark lock, even after using it a bunch, I am never quite sure when I'm pulling back on this lock if I've pulled it back far enough. I will do this all the time where I will pull it back, think I'm far enough, and then try to swing it shut or try to close it shut. And it'll either, sort of push through, like right here, it's not really far enough, and I'm sort of pushing past the lock, or I'll pull it back a bit and it won't shut at all. I always have to pull it further than I think, and the real reason I have to pull it further than I think is there just isn't enough travel on this lock to give you that feedback, to give you that certainty that you have with something like the shark lock when you know you're actuating this lock and moving it back and moving it so that that blade can close. You combine that with the fact that this is a pretty rounded profile. Again, if I compare your shark lock here, the shark lock is notoriously sharp. But that's why it only needs 3 jimps here, because you've got a very sharp jimping and a sharp shape to catch your finger on that's angled pretty perpendicular to where you're actuating, so it catches it very easily. This here, it's angled so far away, the jimping is doing all the work. And so it ends up being exactly what I said with, it's the opposite of this, where this was too easy on your thumb, so it didn't catch. This here, it ends up being brutal on your finger in a way that I usually don't complain about, to actuate this super lock, because you're just digging into that jimping and pulling back relatively hard to try to get this blade out. And then on top of that, the shark lock gives you a truly free dropping action. And the reason is because the way the shark lock is designed, when that lock is pulled back, this thing is literally just spinning freely in the pivot. There's nothing on the blade. That is not the case with the super lock here. And, you know, it's close. It swings quite freely. But between just the fact that, you know, it's a little squeaky on the bearings in here and just the way the super lock functions, it drops nicely, but it's not a free dropper. And so you combine all of that, and the super lock has been a uniformly unpleasant lock to use. And after using it on this knife, it is not a lock that I am interested in trying on any other knife, frankly. I was interested in potentially trying the Wii Vision R before handling this. I am not anymore. I don't like the super lock. It's just not interesting to me. 1 second. Yes, the super lock. Sorry about that. Yes, I am not interested in trying the super lock again on any other knife after trying it on this. I think that is frankly the most disappointing part of this knife. I thought it was very cool that Tactile Knife Co. was giving us a super lock, especially a made in the USA super lock, but I do not like it in its execution. And so, where does that leave us with the Chupacabra? That leaves us with a very, very disappointing knife. Again, my first impression of this knife was fantastic. I thought that I was going to come out and say this is my favorite Tactile Knife Company knife. The blade is great, the ergonomics are great, the blade stock is smartly designed, it's nice and handle heavy, it's great to use, it feels great in the hand, it's a little heavy in the pocket, but I can understand that from an ergonomic perspective, all that sort of stuff. All that came out of my first couple days. And, you know, I figured that the thumb stud and the super lock, I didn't love them in those first couple days, but I figured I would get used to them. I did not get used to them, and the more that I used them, the less that I liked them. And the fact is, the more that I used this knife, the more the pivot problem started to come out. The more that it started to feel heavy in the pocket. And the fact that that heaviness improved the ergonomics of it became a little bit less excusable when I found myself carrying this knife less than a lot of my other 3.3-inch blades because of that weight. And so this ends up being a knife that gets the really important stuff really, really right. This is an excellent blade design. It's an excellent grind. It's a very, very good handle design. And the fact is, if Tactile Knife Company had made this, let's say, in full aluminum or in titanium or in something that brought this down to, say, 3.5 ounces, maybe thinned it out a little bit and made it just a traditional frame lock or a button lock or something like that, put a better thumb stud on it, this could be a killer user of a knife. Because there is a great knife hiding in this overall profile here, especially at a $250 price point, made in the USA. But in its current form, I will say there are people that are going to love this, and they could be the target audience. If you're the sort of person that doesn't really care about the weight of your carry, you're okay with heavier stuff, you want a smaller to mid-size knife, You're okay with it being a little bit heavier. You want to be able to use and abuse it. You want those robust ergonomics that are going to be secure in the hand. And you're okay with your knife being a little finicky. You're okay tooling around with it every once in a while, and you're okay getting used to some of its quirks, then okay. And, I can see some trades folks and things like that might fall into that category because it's really, really good in use. But for the vast majority of people in this current form, this is a hard knife to recommend. It is a knife that the more I have used it, the less I have liked it, and that's really disappointing. And I came into this wanting to like it. I like Tactile Knife Co. as a company. I like a lot of what they're doing. I like their level of transparency. I even like their business model. The way they do profit sharing, things like that, is really, for lack of a better term, inspiring to me. And they seem like good folks. But I can't strongly recommend this knife in this form. I think especially with, the issues they had with the Maverick and with, the improvements they made with the Rockwall over time and things like that, I think what Tactile needs to start getting a little bit better at doing possibly is getting their V1 of their knives out there and then getting to, sort of like CQI, getting to a V2 of their knives relatively quickly, because both of these knives are very good but flawed in their current configuration. My Maverick review is coming up. That is another knife that I absolutely loved on first blush, and the longer I've owned it, the less I have liked it. Particularly because as I start to look at its competition more objectively, it starts to look less and less favorable. But the Chupacabra in particular, especially at the $250 price point, is almost really compelling. But those couple quirks, the usability of the thumb stud, the usability of the super lock, the little issues I've had with fit and finish, and the fact that it is just heavier than I would like to an extent that has deterred me from carrying it, are all significant enough issues that it makes me hard to recommend it. And frankly, again, if I pull out another knife with a very similar profile, very similar size, and I use it for very similar things, after I was done sort of really putting this through its paces to test it, there's not a single time that I've carried the Chupacabra over my Endella. And the Chupacabra has better ergonomics, and it's got a slightly better blade, but the overall package, in terms of what I want to carry with me all day, is still just better on something like the Endella. And it's not that the Endella is exceptional. The Endella is a very good knife in this size range and in this sort of profile. You could put the Inkosi in here. You could put the Atom in here if you want to push it. You could put a 3-inch Hinderer in here. There's all sorts of options. It's a very competitive space, and this just has a couple too many quirks to be highly recommendable. It's really close, and I hope that this design continues to be iterated on. But I do think, unless there's a big improvement to the super lock that makes it feel more like the shark lock, that lack of tactility is a really big issue for me. It makes the lock just feel uncertain in a way that's really, really unsatisfying, and frankly a little bit dangerous, because I'm not getting the feedback I need to know whether that lock is engaged or disengaged. They got to either fix that super lock, or they've got to ditch the super lock. They got to fix the thumb stud, and they got to find a way to just make the whole thing a little lighter and a little more streamlined. There is a great knife hiding in here. It needs a little more iteration. Those are my final thoughts on the Chupacabra. Hope you found this useful. Hope you found this helpful. Hopefully it gives you everything you need to know whether this is the knife for you or not. It's a great knife in a lot of ways, but it does definitely have some flaws. So know those flaws before you go in. And if you want to get one, they're pretty readily available on the secondary market. They're not hard to find on the primary market either, so you'll be able to try one out for yourself. Hope you found this helpful. If there are any knives you want me to look at, please drop it down in the comments. I do focus mostly on USA makers. They don't need to be made in the USA, but I do prefer if the maker is at least based in the USA. And that's mostly just because I don't have the time or interest in keeping up with all of the Chinese and overseas stuff that is coming out. Like I'm never going to be the guy that reviews every Kubi and Wii and all that sort of stuff. I could not care less about those knives. Literally could not care less about them. But if there's anything that you'd like me to review, please feel free to suggest it. Any questions you want answered, please feel free to suggest them. I'm going to try to start doing more sort of Q&A or more info-based videos going forward. And if there's any feedback you have for the channel, please let me know as well. Always looking to improve. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.